Welcome to Two Taps and Friends. Grab your favorite drink, get comfy, and let's dive into another episode of Two Taps and Friends.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Two Taps and Friends. This is Daniel Rosenberg, and I have a special guest today, Dr. Michael Brannon, who is the foremost forensic psychologist in this area. He is the co-director of the Institute for Behavioral Sciences and Law. And Dr. Brannon is in the world of criminal defense or in law. He is the foremost expert. He's the biggest name you can have, and I'm honored to have you. Welcome, Dr. Brannon. How are you?
Thanks so much, Danny. It's good to be here. Thanks for asking me to be part of this.
It's my honor. You know, anytime I could pick the brain of somebody like you and have it done for the viewers, I'm going to jump on that. So thank you for coming on. First off, Doc, if you don't mind, I'd like to just jump in. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background for the viewers so they kind of understand where you got, how you got here, where you are, who you are.
Sure. So I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in psychology and a doctoral degree in clinical psychology. And I've been practicing in this area of psychology since I was licensed in 1990, although I did a lot of mental health work prior to that time. Currently, I'm the co-director, as you said, of the Institute for Behavioral Sciences and the Law, doing almost exclusively forensic psychology cases, or cases that are in some ways related to the law. So that's the bulk of my practice. And we've been doing that, at a pretty high clip for quite some period of time now.
Right. And that's predominantly in the criminal defense world, the criminal world, right?
Well, it really is across, Danny. I mean, it's the majority is criminal, but I do personal injury work and family work. So there's psych issues or forensic psychology issues in all of those venues. So whether it's a substance abuse evaluation or a custody evaluation, or whether it's a personal injury, emotional distress case, or a criminal case, like a death penalty case, there's psychological issues that fall under the banner of forensic psychology in all those areas. Right.
And just to kind of like dive into, and look, in your experience, I know from working with you in my world of the criminal defense world, we work with a gambit of different psychological issues, right? It comes up so much. And just so the viewers understand, where Dr. Brannon comes in is when I bring up an issue of whether it be a person's competency or whether they're insane or just sometimes the state wants to get an analysis, the court wants to get an analysis more specifically about the composition or how this person is, what kind of a threat they are to society or may not be to society. It really is a wide spectrum. But I just wanted to kind of jump into something that I think the viewers would probably be most interesting in the layman's. We talk about, your history, your experience, and you have a vast experience. You've testified in probably hundreds of cases. I don't even know, maybe thousands at this point.
Actually, thousands at this point.
I was just going to say, right? Thousands.
I unfortunately had to count them up for a federal case. So it's actually close to 2,000 cases on both the state and federal level. So that's a whole lot of backbreaking work over those years.
Oh, for sure. And when it comes to the category that most like laymen would be interested in, you have all these shows like Mind Hunters and when it comes to like how many murder cases have you been a part of or evaluated for? I know you can't give me a number, but I'm sure a lot of them. Is that accurate?
Yeah, hundreds of murder cases, and many of those are death penalty cases.
Right.
So they're first-degree murder cases. They're capital cases where, death is on the table potentially, and many of those are sanity cases, or you see them later as a sentencing evaluation where multiple forensic psychologists become involved.
Right, and when you're involved in a I'm sure it's different stages of the case, right? I mean, there's a stage where maybe the defense is claiming that a person is incompetent, or there's a stage where the defense is claiming the person is criminally insane. Can you talk a little bit about the differences with that? Because I think most people don't really know, laymen don't know the differences of that and why it would even be relevant to a case or a litigation.
Sure, Dan, I'd be happy to. So there's a number of ways that forensic psychologists can get involved in cases. Now, some of them just happen to be like areas of competency to proceed. Or does the person have the ability to be able to testify relevantly and consult with their attorney? It's a here and now evaluation. Like, what's the person's mental state right now as they sit here in front of me? And can they fairly participate in court? The law says that people have to be competent, understand the proceedings, be able to give information, both to their attorney as well as to talk in court about it. And if they can't, they're incompetent because of mental health reasons. And we have to do whatever we can to restore them to competency. So that's one type of an evaluation. People confuse that sometimes with a sanity evaluation. A sanity evaluation is really what the person's mental status was back crime. So it's a retrospective analysis. How was their mental health functioning back then when this act got committed? And did it impact or affect their behavior at all at that time? And more importantly, their ability to know what they were doing and to know what they were doing was wrong. So those are very different standards. And then the last one that you mentioned there is the court may also be interested in mitigating factors. Let's say someone is found guilty of first-degree murder or of any crime. What are the mitigating factors? Was the person suffering from mental health disorders that didn't rise to the level of defense? Or were they severely depressed or had drug or alcohol problems or were severely abused as a child and had post-traumatic stress disorder? So there's a lot of different avenues and a lot of different ways in which forensic psychology and psychiatry, for that matter, can get involved in a legal case.
Right. And when you're evaluating, let's say, the threat to the community that a person may, for reoffending or their tendency to violence, what are some of the cues that you're looking for in these people, or what are the factors? If you could tell it, obviously I've seen these, and you know them like the back of your hand, but if you could kind of almost dumb it down for the viewers, and I don't mean to call viewers dumb, but you know what I mean, speak in layman's terms so that they understand, like, what cues are you looking for where you would say, Dr. Brannon would say, hey, this person's a danger to society, this person needs to be incarcerated, or whatever may be the recommendation.
Yeah, fortunately, Danny, it's not that complex. Like, there's a lot of legal issues. I don't understand what I'm in there because I'm not a lawyer. Right. But from a psychology standpoint, it really, some of the concepts aren't filled with psychobabble and jargon. We do know that certain things are more associated with reoffending behavior or being violent or sexually offending again in the future or being engaging in domestic violence in the future. So we know that some factors are just more important and more relevant than others. Like, for instance, some of these things wouldn't be surprising to people at all, but we know the younger that you are, the more likely you are to reoffend. Younger people reoffend at a much higher rate. We also know that men reoffend at a much higher rate than women. So being a male is a risk factor, believe it or not, but it's true. And then how many times you've engaged in, let's say, a sexual offense, or how many times you've engaged in violence towards another person, the use of drugs and alcohol, all of those things are important. They're actually a fancy name for them. They're called actuarial factors. It's the same way that your insurance rates are set. The younger you are, the more likely you are to get into automobile accidents, so your rates are higher. Or the way that they predict where hurricanes might hit, atmospheric conditions and certain other factors that are going on at that time can make more accurate predictions about what might happen. In psychology, we do the same thing, rely on the science of psychology to identify the factors that are at the highest rate or risk of a probability of reoffending in whatever area we're being asked to look at, and we just apply those factors and give a risk range.
Right. And just to get a little bit more specific, so in a person that, let's say, is accused of murder or even been convicted of a murder, and I think this is, what are some of the common traits or cues, I don't know if I'm using the wrong term, right? Some of the common observation or traits of individual that you see in the vast experience that you have when it comes to someone who's committed multiple murders, or, as we say, serial killers, or things that are, that Hollywood kind of focuses in on. What are some of the same factors that you see in those kind of cases?
Wow, Danny, I mean, that question alone could go on all day in terms of responding to it. I mean, the first thing we'd say is that there is no single profile. There is no one profile of a person who kills other people. And if we could only say one factor that explains most of them, it's impulsive response or anger. So that's the most common reason. Most people only kill somebody once if they're going to murder somebody. People who kill only kill once usually. Because it's that person they're angry with, who stole their girl, or robbed their money, or, insulted them, or did whatever it is they think they did, fired them from a job that they had for a long period of time.
Right.
So most murders that happen are impulsive. Most murders are only singular. Most murders, are based on poor impulses. You just build up and build up and build up and finally have this moment of explosion. And that explains most murders.
Right.
But then there's other murders that aren't so easily explained. And those things are fueled by drugs and alcohol, or sometimes by mental illness. And sometimes they're fueled by personality disorders, like people being antisocial or psychopathic. You hear that in the TV shows a lot on different criminals. They'd make you think that everybody was like that, a psychopathic, antisocial killer. It's not really the case, but there is a high level of that in some cases, especially serial killers or repeat killers.
Right. Right. And let's talk about the personality disorders. That kind of segues into personality disorders. I think a lot of people don't really have an understanding of what a personality disorder is. For example, someone that's actually diagnosed as a socio-narcissist, right?
Right.
You hear people throw that term around at people, he's a narcissist, she's a narcissist. Can you give the viewers kind of the clinical and your experience, the definition of what a social narcissist is, their danger levels, or if you give us like a little bit of a synopsis on that, that would be great, because I think most people have a mishandle of what it is. I think there's symptoms, but go ahead. Sorry.
Sure, you're kind of combining terms there, and that's pretty common, because some of these personality disorders, which are maladaptive ways of behaving, they're characteristic maladaptive ways of confronting your world and interacting with other people. And that's what makes them personality disorders. They cause some interference in a person's life, usually a very negative interference. If you're talking about things like sociopathy, that's not really in the DSM-5, but usually people, what they mean by that is they mean antisocial or sometimes psychopathic. Those are people that have no remorse for any action they do. They have no empathy, no connection or strong feelings with other people. They're more likely to be aggressive and violent and break rules and regulations and interfere in other people's lives in oftentimes disastrous ways. They're people without a conscience oftentimes. And so they can do things that the rest of us don't do because we have an internal set of rules and regulations. Narcissism, on the other hand, is self-love. It's a self-love, though, to the exclusion of everybody else. We should all love ourselves, right? But in narcissism, it's to the exclusion of everybody else. We love ourselves and nobody else, or only people who adore us and give us reinforcement about how wonderful we are. We can love them if we're narcissistic. There's also a sense of grandiosity if you're narcissistic. The world kind of revolves around you. You're the best at everything that you do, or anything that you want to do or take on, and you're the smartest, best looking, most efficient in all areas that you perform in. So that's kind of narcissism, and it kind of shuts down your ability to connect or relate to other people in a healthy way. Narcissists oftentimes are in relationships, but they're very one-sided relationships, and many times we see them in the criminal justice system because in only thinking about themselves, they don't consider the harm that they can do to other people by their actions.
Right. And when you're diagnosing that, what are you looking for when you're interviewing? Because I know sometimes you walk in and you have like an hour to make a determination as best you can with your experience. What are the things you're looking for? Is it familial background? Is it environmental? Is it all of it? If you can give us a little bit about that. What does Dr. Brannon look for? Right.
Yeah, it really varies. So your clinical interview is important. I mean, are there other people in this person's life that they care about, that they worry about, that they have compassion for? Do they only talk about themselves during the interview? Do they talk about all the many accomplishments they've had, kind of pat themselves on the back throughout the time that you have with them? There's also some psychological tests that we can do that assess for personality disorders, especially narcissism. And then also talking to other people about them. So if they have family members or friends or even in relationships that can talk about them, if they can give you a rundown of how that person relates to other people. Does the world center around them? Do they only want to talk about themselves? Are they uninterested? And they may even have kids. Are they disinterested in their children's activities, or only if it aggrandizes them in some way? So it's a multifaceted approach that you'd want to find out about what's the central focus of this person's life. Is it themselves? Is it people? Is it a combination of both? Or is it me to the exclusion of everyone else? If their pronouns are me, my, and mine, then you kind of got an idea that there might be a narcissistic personality going on. And Danny, the difficult thing sometimes is they can be mixed in, just like medical diagnoses can be mixed in. You can have more than one personality disorder. So I just talked about antisocial a minute ago, and now I'm talking about narcissistic. Well, you could be both. In fact, narcissism can be part of an antisocial personality disorder. So when you look at these things, you can, oftentimes they're not so discrete that you can say that goes in that category, that goes in that category. Sometimes they fit a couple of different categories, and those are the most challenging cases.
Right. And what have you found and I'm sorry if I'm kind of repeating myself, but what have you found when you've seen an individual that when you've decided this person legitimately is a danger, this person needs to be, confined for the rest of their life? Is it always a combination? Is it sometimes one to the extreme? Or what do you find the most, I guess, give us the most consistent profile you have for that kind of an individual that you've seen,
So we usually get in trouble on profiles, but what I can tell you about is factors that are most associated with, and let's say violence risk, because there's a lot of different kinds of risk of child abuse, risk of sexual reoffending, risk of domestic violence. Here we're talking about, risk of violence towards other people, like in murderers. So when you're starting to talk about risk factors, there's some things that are almost always associated with it. We had a maxim in psychology for a long time that said the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Well, that's only relevant in the case of people who murder or do serious harm to other people if that's a pattern in their life, not if it just happened once. We can all get so mad that we jump out of the car or during the middle of a traffic stop and get angry with somebody who's been driving slow and brake checking us and do something stupid like hit them and they fall down and hit their head and get hurt or die. So we can all do a stupid act and have terrible consequences as a result. It's the pattern of violence that we look at. So those people that had more violent episodes in their life starting early on, like in school, like in grade school, where they suspended for fights and physical altercations, problems like that, maybe fighting with teachers or stealing property from other kids and then fighting with them and not giving it back. Early onset violence, frequent violence, all those things contribute to assessing a person as a higher probability of a risk. There's some other factors too, and some which I didn't mention before. The use of drugs and alcohol. That's one of the most common findings in acts of aggression. People who abuse, especially drugs like cocaine or flakka or alcohol. Those substances are oftentimes associated with increased risks of violence in the future. And I'll mention one other one for you, although there's many of them. The other is any kind of neurological damage or brain damage. We do know that there's a higher rate of violence or aggression for people who have suffered head injuries, especially multiple head injuries. They have difficulty controlling their impulses. Not all of them, but many of them have difficulty putting the brakes on their behavior, which ordinarily most people would put the brakes on their behavior. So those factors all start to coalesce. And as you can think about this recipe for danger, the more of the risk factors that you have, your age and your gender, whether you've been violent before, if you've had a head injury or a mental health problem that has things to do like paranoia, mania, if all of those things can kind of work together to increase or decrease your risk.
Right. And so it brings up an interesting topic, the CTE topic, right? And I'm sure you've worked with it before, but I think you kind of explained it. Can you talk to them about the CTE, what that is, the symptoms they're finding, and how they've even gotten to understand this, the portion you're talking about, the brain injuries and leading to violence? If you could talk just a little bit more about that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, so all head injuries are not the same. So some head injuries result in memory deficits and problems. Some head injuries result in poor attention span. But some head injuries, especially to the front part of your head, some head injuries, result in poor impulse control, interference in judgment, and decision-making, and being able to anticipate future consequences. Like if I do A, B may occur. Someone may get seriously hurt or die as a result of my actions. So those kinds of things can happen when a person has a head injury or especially repeated head injuries. You can see more impulsivity, and there's actually good research that talks about people who have committed violent crimes have a much higher probability of having had a childhood head injury or other head injuries at some point in their life. So it's not a guarantee, it's not an assurance of violence, but it increases your risk potential if your brain's been shaked around like scrambled eggs, and as a result of that, you've had damage. Your brain's in a fluid inside your head, and if you get hit in the head, what can happen oftentimes, even if your head doesn't get cut open, is your brain kind of bounces against your skull inside of your head in that fluid. And that can cause bruising on your brain. Some of that bruising can be permanent and result in things like not being able to control your anger or your aggression.
Oh, that's it makes total sense, and it's kind of a little surprising that it took this long to kind of figure that out. Or maybe the sports community knew about it, but they didn't really want to talk about it, and now it's come out because you're seeing a lot of, and some of these sports aren't that old, and maybe now you're seeing the progression of some of these things, so it makes sense. But
hey Dan, you talking about sports? I just want to mention one thing on that.
Sure.
It's just as likely the person may turn the violence towards themselves. So we have seen cases like that, Junior Seau being one of them and many others,
Sure.
who turn the violence from their head injuries or CTEs towards themselves. So in many ways, they may be as high a suit, they may be a risk to other people. And that's as a result oftentimes of having a series of different head injuries.
Sure. And just to stay on just to stay on, because I'm going to move on to another topic in a minute, but staying on to the repeated killings or the mass killings, I'm talking about the Parkland case just a little bit, not to get too much into details. I don't know if you were involved in that at all. I don't know if you were actually the doctor involved, but just so people can understand it in the death penalty phase, what was happening. Because, I think a lot of laymen don't understand, they think that he got off scot-free and that he, you know what I mean? But they didn't understand that there were separate stages. Could you talk a little bit about the death penalty phase and why mental health is a mitigator, or what you're looking for, what you're presenting to the courts in those situations?
So, Danny, I was involved. I was a state witness. Matter of fact, I testified in the case in a pre-trial motion for the admissibility of social media. Interestingly enough, so some of the things that he was watching, viewing on YouTube, the killer in that case, whose name I still don't want to use to try to not immortalize him or make him famous as a result of his deplorable actions.
Agreed.
But I was intricately involved and saw all aspects of that case from start to finish. Over 40,000 pages of documents to review, not to mention videos and audios, et cetera, of his kind of life history. And what I would tell you is that in terms of the death penalty sentencing, in that case, the defense, they accepted that he was guilty. So they pled guilty on the case. And what they did at that point was that averted a trial in regards to the guilt phase. Right? Is he guilty or not guilty? Did he do it? Did somebody else do it? Was he mentally ill at the time? So there's an insanity defense, or was it self-defense? So they abandoned that. The defense team made the decision to do that, plead him guilty. After all, it was on video, school video. And so as a result, the only question left was life or death. The state said they're going to go forward with a death penalty sentencing on this. And so that phase in front of a jury only has to do with what happens to that person. In death penalty cases, only one of two things can happen, either life in prison or death. So that was the gist of what occurred with the jurors there and the presentations that were made over many weeks in Judge Shear's courtroom, and being able to try at that point to convince jurors that either a person's acts were so atrocious and terrible and awful and heinous that they should get the death penalty, or that there were mitigating factors in this person's life and in his upbringing in terms of how he interacted with the world and how people treated him that made him stand out, and there where he shouldn't get the full brunt of the punishment that was possible in this case, which was the death penalty, and instead get life. And in this case, one and then later two of the jurors decided that they felt life was a sufficient punishment. And at that time, that was sufficient. Florida has changed their jury vote since then, but at that time, it only took one juror to say that they felt life was an appropriate sentence for a person in a similar situation to get life in prison as opposed to the death penalty.
Right. And I mean, to a lot of people, and just to explain to the viewers that the defense, that's really defense is playing on almost the emotions of the jurors, trying to get sympathy and asking the forensic psychologist to give a background and give history. Is that a fair statement?
It is, Danny, especially in this case, although I will say that the defense did present a mountain of evidence that he had problems and difficulties, the shooter had problems and difficulties and issues in his life, and they put on many experts to show that, to display that. And what was interesting about this case was that the state had doctors who were saying the exact opposite, who were saying that there weren't issues or problems that rose to the level where they should be considered as mitigating factors. So the jurors have to try to decide between a large group of very good, very smart, very renowned experts who are all saying something different. And that's the tough job of the jurors, to be able to sort all this out and say, life or death is my vote.
Right, and that comes an interesting topic because we talked about, I just had Larry Schweiker and Michael Dye, some other lawyers I'm sure, that we were on here, we were talking about judges.
Yes.
Yeah, and we were talking about judges and trying not to name names, but we were talking about biases, and you see it in every field. Like, if you could talk a little bit about the contrast, that there's some doctors that have one opinion and the others have the completely opposite opinion, and these are all doctors that are very esteemed, very experienced. And what would you attribute that to? Just human bias? Their history? What is your position on that? Because you have doctors that come up and say the opposite of what you say. And you're, obviously the good thing about you is you have the reputation where most people rely on your opinion over theirs, but you see that. What is your position on that?
Well, thank you, Danny. I appreciate that. And what I would say to you is that there's a rich body of research about bias, and that's not just within my profession of forensic psychology or even forensic psychiatry. It's in all fields that you wouldn't imagine that would be the case. Fingerprint experts, ballistics, accident recreation, all of those kinds of things, polygraph tests, blood spatter, all of those areas and more have been found by the Innocence Project to have bias in them in regards to opinions they gave. And it's exactly what you said. We do know that there's some things that can influence even really smart, well-meaning experts can be influenced by people who hire them. Not purposely, not because they want to do it, they're getting paid to do it, and they're picked by one side as opposed to the other. But those things can influence an expert's opinion. So when you're giving an opinion, you want to try to make sure it's as bias-free as possible. And there's a number of steps that you can do that. But all of us, myself included, are subject to that. We're subject to the influences and power of someone telling you what a wonderful doctor you are. Okay. And we picked you over all these other doctors, and we're paying you really good money to come in here and give opinions on our case. And, this poor tragic boy or this terrible, awful person, whichever side you're hired from, whatever narrative you get, can be influential in terms of how you interpret very close calls in the data. So when you make that leap from the data to your opinion, the very close calls, more often than not, tend to go to the side that hired the expert as opposed to the opposing opinion.
Makes absolute sense. Yeah. So moving on to another topic that I think is more shocking and kind of hard for people to wrap their head around and scary for people is we'll talk about the sex offenders, okay? When I was young in my career, when you're a public defender, you don't really get to pick your cases, right? So, but you get these cases, and when I went in private practice, I would kind of shy away from them if I could. It wasn't my favorite kind of cases to defend. Not to say that I haven't, but on one of the first major ones I had to kind of learn this entire field, right? And the first thing that any of my colleagues said is, listen, you have to get a touch. Whether you got to get a touch offender evaluation or a sex offender evaluation, and Dr. Brannon is the guy you need to go to, right? Because you're an expert, very much an expert in this field. And what was scary to me is that this is such a known body of or group of people, or historically, that the government has literally a way of handling and evaluating them. To me, that was striking. Oh my God, it's almost this secret world that's happening that people don't want to talk about, don't know about. Can you talk about touch offender and that kind of evaluation and sex offenders in general? I know I'm asking for a general thing. I think I'll try to nitpick some questions in the middle, but
sure,
if you could talk about that a little bit.
So again, thanks for the kind words. And what I would say, Danny, is that there's a lot of people. There's an organization I belong to, the Association for the Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuse. And I lecture for them, both in the state and around the country, on various issues of sexual offending and who poses a risk and who doesn't. It's very much like what we talked about before, in that we know that there's certain factors that make you more of a risk of reoffending than others. There's some people who will reoffend, and no matter what intervention you make, they're going to reoffend. People have a lot of mistaken assumptions about people who commit sex offenses and what makes them risky or not. For instance, we do know that people who only view child pornography, or what now is called child sexually exploitive materials or child sexual abuse materials, We know that people who do that pose a lower risk than someone who touches another person in a sexual offense or tries to touch them. That could even be contact by internet or by telephone. So we know the people who are at the greatest risk are those who touch, and we know that most sex offenders do not reoffend. And especially those that are only looking at things, and when I say only, I don't mean to minimize it, but only looking at images. Those individuals are the least likely, and the people who are the least likely to offend at all are women. So that's a very small percentage of the sex offender population, but women, and especially women who are only looking at child pornography. So that's the lowest grouping. But we do know there's factors, again, that increase your risk, like, again, prior sex offenses, like if the person was somebody you knew or didn't know, if the person is a family member or not, those are risk factors. Your age, again, a risk factor. Violations of any kind of court-imposed sanctions, a risk factor. Pedophilic interest. People who have pedophilic interest are, of course, more likely to reoffend against children. But we know most people with a pedophilic orientation or who are pedophiles don't offend against children. Most of them are just viewing child pornography images. So there's a lot of misconceptions about who's a danger and who isn't, where they're a danger, and how long they stay a danger.
Right. And I think that's the most troubling, and it traumatized me because at the time I had a young child, and my wife, we're going to pediatricians, and I'm meeting with all these people at the state that are experts in this, and like, you start to, I think people think like that you can spot a sex offender by looking at them, or you could spot a pedophilic person by looking. And I would tell my wife, I'm like, listen, you can't, it doesn't work that way. Like, I wouldn't let my kids sleep over at their friend's house for the first few years. I was so paranoid. And when you start to see this world, and I'm sure, you live in that world too, like, well, we could talk about that a little bit, but what are some of can you talk about how, like, not common, but how it's indiscreet? It's not always a physical thing that you can see, right? Like they say, well, sex offenders have the glasses and they're wearing the monitors, and I'm like, yeah, those are the easy ones. But the ones that are, most of them are not
that easy.
Yeah, right. So
yeah,
you talk about that.
Easy, Danny. I mean, that would be remarkable, because if we could pick them out so easily, maybe artificial intelligence will help us to do that at some point in time in the next decade or so.
Right.
But no, it's not, and especially with child sexually exploitive materials. When you look at that, usually those people are married. They're usually in relationships. They're usually, good family, strong family upbringing. Many of them have never had a legal offense before. Many of them not even a traffic citation. So these are usually law-abiding citizens, professionals in the community, people who are working full-time jobs, who have families and children, et cetera, and have never touched or harmed anybody. But the reason I tell you that is because invariably their partners, when I talk to them, are shocked. They had no idea. They didn't even know they were watching adult pornography, nonetheless child pornography. So they're usually shocked by their behavior. And as a result, because that behavior is usually done in quiet areas after everyone's gone to bed, or in the office, or on their cell phone when they're sitting in their cars somewhere. So those behaviors are secret behaviors. It's like opening someone's medicine cabinet and being surprised by the medication you see that they're prescribed. It's the same way with child pornography. When you look at someone's computer and they do computer searches and see the type of images they were looking at, people are stunned, because they would have never thought that this person, with the public status that they have and the family private status that they have, would ever do such a thing. So it's shocking, and it's oftentimes people you would never suspect.
Right. And when you're in your evaluations, and many of them that you've done, and the experience that you have, what is the most common? And I when I say common, I'm not, it's not a good term for it, but what is the most common, upbringing or factors that lead a person to is it by birth, or is it upbringing, behavior that leads a person to get to this point, or to get to a point where they're interested in child pornography or anything like that? I know it's probably not a simple answer, but I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, of course, remember, there's many different kinds of sexual offenses, like rape,
Sure.
A sexual offense. So we have a lot of different ways. I mean, even some of the cyber stalkings are sexual in nature, or showing and displaying pictures that you've taken in the privacy of your relationship with your girlfriend or boyfriend, and after you've broken up, putting those on the internet. So there's a lot of ways of sexually offending. Voyeuristic behavior, taping people's, bathroom behaviors in the bathroom in your office, having a camera there, using that for your own sexual gratification. There's as many different kinds of sexual offending behaviors imaginable that you could possibly think of. And the internet has widened that scope so that there's even more different kinds of sexual offending behaviors people can engage in over time. So it's not just that you could meet up with a child. You can actually meet a child on real time on Zoom and engage in sexual acts, masturbatory behaviors, or have them display themselves in some way, online, which was, of course, never possible before. So there's a lot of different offending behaviors. So Danny, if you ask about in general, sex offenders in general, there's usually two factors that are found, not always, but usually two factors are found: problems in forming meaningful relationships with others, and antisocial personality orientations, lack of capacity for empathy or remorse for their behavior, or connections, ability to connect with other people. So those are deficits that you see: relationship deficits, empathy deficits. So that's the two biggest factors. If you want to add in those that look at child pornography or who touch children, sexually abuse children, there's a high preponderance, of course, pedophilic behavior there. And oftentimes we also see mental health issues. Person's confused, chaotic, doesn't realize the seriousness of their actions or behaviors, or they engage in behavior with someone who's an adolescent. So you have an adult who's engaging in behavior with a 15 or 16-year-old who misreads all of the cues, who misreads this person's approach and behavior to them, feels like this is their true love and it's just a matter of age, and they connect with that person and feel like love can overcome all of that. So people tell themselves misrepresentations and cognitive distortions to justify the relationship with 15 or 16-year-olds sometimes. So again, there's a myriad of excuses and reasons and rationalizations that people make for their behavior.
Right. And just to bring our conversation around, when you're evaluating these different kinds of people, and I had a therapist, I had a spiritual therapist. We were talking about, human nature, good energy, bad energy, that kind of a thing. In your evaluations and your history of seeing people come in front of you and kind of following along with them, going through cases with them, what is the number one the factor that when you see a person that's actually rehabilitated or gotten to a point where they are able to, progress in society and do better, what are some of the factors that you see that would lead you to say this person has the ability to rehabilitate or is rehabilitated, in whether it be violent offenses or sex offenses?
There's a couple of factors, Danny. I mean, the biggest one is kind of the ability to empathize with other people and to see the harm that you can cause to other people by your actions. And there's empathy deficits in individuals oftentimes that engage in any type of sex offense. So whether it's sexually offending, putting, drugs in in a young lady's drink at a bar, and then when she passes out, taking her home and sexually assaulting her, or sexually assaulting a child in an amusement park. Those people usually have empathy deficits that therapy and treatment, which is long-term with sex offenders. Sex offender treatment usually lasts years. And over those course of years, they're trying to retrain or maybe train for the first time the person's ability to empathize or know the impact of their behavior. Oftentimes, people who look at child pornography don't think there's any impact at all. It's already there. The videos are already there. What harm could they cause anybody? Not thinking that every time someone views that person at the worst time of their life, that victim, it re-victimizes them. So getting people to understand the impact of their behavior by doing the things that they do, from viewing to touching to sexually assaulting, is important. Then the other part of it is what's called a good lives model. It's teaching people that there's a better way of going about meeting your needs that's going to keep you out of trouble. And if for nothing else, you can engage in behaviors and make decisions that are satisfying to you. Even if they may not be the most satisfying, they're still satisfying, without winding up in jail or prison or on probation or with residency restrictions. So getting people to think more rationally about their behavior and to empathize better with other people. And then, of course, there's all those other side issues: not use drugs and alcohol, take your medication if you have mental health issues so that you don't fall back into that trap again, and get people around you who care about you, a support group that you can turn to when you're tempted or have some of those same old bad thinking kind of thoughts going through your head.
Oh, that. It's all fascinating stuff. I know that you're a very, very busy Dr. Brannon, so I don't want to keep you for too long. Is there anything that I mean, in the last 5 minutes, is there anything that you want to discuss or talk about with the viewers at all that comes to your mind?
So, Danny, one of the things that people ask me about a lot is, how do you know people aren't faking when they're talking to you? How do you know they really have mental health problems? How do you know they really have issues and they're not just putting this on to get out of their charges or get out of jail or not be put to death? And so I think that's always a fascinating area for people, because we're not human lie detectors, but we do have some very good strategies, and we even have a name for this. We call it malingering. People faking mental health symptoms or intellectual deficits, like that they're intellectually disabled, or what we used to call mentally retarded. And so now what we do is we have a whole series of empirically driven or scientific methods of approaching this to see whether or not someone's being straightforward when they're speaking to us. And it's not foolproof. We don't have the 100% ability to look into the crystal ball and say, aha, this person's telling the truth and this person's faking. But we do have some pretty good tests that allow us to check to see if the person's responding in the same way that other people who have been faking in the past have responded, to see if the symptoms they're presenting are different than what we know real mental illness looks like, to see if there's consistency, and also to see whether or not this is the first time they're reporting these symptoms. Like before this incident that occurred that got them in trouble, they never had any mental health problems before, but then suddenly they're hearing voices. Speaking to other people about their past and reviewing their records, especially the jail records, gives us a rich source of information about whether what the person is presenting to you is actually accurate and straightforward, or if it's a manipulation to try to get themselves out of legal difficulty.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting thing, and especially in the criminal defense world. You know, a lot of these offenders, they hear, oh, if I have an evaluation, I can get out of things, and, you know, I'll just tell this or tell that. And especially with specific doctors like you, you're like, listen, you need to just be honest and talk to him, because he's going to spot that like that. You know what I mean? So I don't know if the snap gets picked up on the microphone, but he's going to spot it very quickly. Malingering, right?
Yeah, and it can happen, Danny, and it can happen too in the family setting, but the opposite. So on family cases, like, when they're looking at child custody cases or visitation privileges or things like that, or whether someone's been a sexual offender or a substance user in a family setting, people are doing the opposite in family cases. They're trying to look better than they are oftentimes. They're trying to look like the Mother Teresa's of parenting. They're trying to look like they're the better and have no problems and difficulties at all, unrealistically so. So you can have feigning good, like people faking good, or people faking bad, more likely in the criminal setting, for some secondary gain, like I get responsibility for my kids, or I get to visit with them more, or I get out of jail or get out of prison as a result. So that assessment has to be part of every forensic evaluation of, how can I trust what this person is telling me, and is it consistent across time? And do all sources of information sort of congeal together to be able to create a picture that says what this person is telling me is absolutely the truth, and it doesn't vary from person to person whom they're talking to.
Right. Well, Doctor, I appreciate you. I appreciate you fighting a good fight. It's always, I'm honored that you're a friend of mine and colleague, and thank you for coming on the show. And for all the viewers, you can look up Dr. Michael Brannon and see a whole body of work and learn about him. And he's very open. The office is open. They're very good people there. They'll talk to you if you need them. If you need anything from Dr. Brannon, I definitely highly recommend him. Doctor, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks,
I
Danny.
hope to have you on again, and I appreciate it all.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation. It's a pleasure being here today.
Take care, Doc. I'll speak to you soon.
Take care.
And to all the viewers, thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe to the channel. I'm being told I need to say that every time we end the episode. We're on YouTube, YouTube Music. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify, iHeartRadio. Thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed Dr. Brannon. I hope to have him on again soon. Thank you all. Love you all. Goodbye. Cut.